Excellent. One more minute and we will kick this off. Okay. It's 11 a.m. here. Gentlemen, welcome. Good morning to everyone outside on YouTube. My name is Damir Marusik. I am executive editor of the American Interest magazine. If you're new to us, I encourage you to please visit our website at www.the-american-interest.com. And please do consider subscribing. We have a real treat for you today. The philosopher and best-selling author Bernard-Henri Lévy is with us to discuss his new book, The Virus in the Age of Madness, which came out last week on Yale University Press. He will be in conversation with our friend and my former professor, Francis Fukuyama, the Olivier Nomelini Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. I'm going to hand over the proceedings to Frank to kick the discussion off in a second. But before that, I encourage everyone out in YouTube land watching live right now to leave questions in chat, and I will get those to Frank to continue the conversation. Frank, over to you.
Thank you very much, Damir. I'm really delighted to be able to be in this conversation with Bernard-Henri Lévy. We've known each other for quite a long time. I think that I do not need to provide an extensive introduction because Bernard-Henri is one of the best-known public intellectuals, not just in France, but in the United States and internationally. He's had a very distinguished career. He has written many books, the most recent of which, let me just point to, prior to this one, The Empire and the Five Kings, America's Abdication and the Fate of the World, The Genius of Judaism, Left in Dark Times, A Stand Against the New Barbarism. And I think that the last time we did a event together, it was when he had just completed American Vertigo, Traveling America in the Steppes of Tocqueville. And today he is introducing to an American audience his latest book, The Virus in the Age of Madness. So with that, Bernard-Henri, why don't you introduce the book briefly, and then I've read it, and we'll have a conversation, and then we can open up the discussion to members of our global audience. So over to you.
Thank you, Frank. First of all, I would like to say that the treat is for me to be in discussion with you today. You are also one of the most respected public intellectuals in your country and in the world. And you are, for me, one of the intellectuals whom I respect and with whom I like to discuss, even if it will be short today. So very happy for that. To sum up the book in a few sentences is very difficult. I would just like to say the following. There is a quote of a very famous German doctor of the end of the 19th century, Rudolf Virchow, who says about a pandemic that a pandemic is a social phenomenon which has some medical aspects. It's a provocative sentence, of course, but it has a part of truth, a social phenomenon with some medical aspects. I wrote this book, which is just released now, in order to study these social phenomena. The medical aspects, I leave it to scientists, to doctors, whom I respect deeply, who do a great job, who save life when they are doing their job in the hospitals, who are trying to research I leave it to them. But the core of the pandemic, which is for me a social phenomenon, this is what I try to deal with in this book. What does it reveal of the world? What sort of new normality are we preparing? In which society are we heading to? these are the questions which I ask myself in this essay, in this nonfiction book, which is, I must say, full of my anger in front of two madnesses: the madness of those who deny the virus and the madness of those who overreact to the virus. Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan say that there are two sorts of madness: the neurosis and the psychosis. Neurosis is denial, the psychosis is overreaction. So we are facing probably the two sorts of craziness in front of the pandemic, and this is what I try to investigate. I cannot hear you.
Sorry, Frank, you're muted. Let's.
Mike.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Sorry. So yes, there's obviously a lot more richness to the book, but that's a good starting point. So let me pose a kind of obvious question. So you say that there's a danger of underreaction and overreaction. You have a lot of rather harsh words for Donald Trump and the way that he has denied the virus and handled it in the United States. But I must say that the vast bulk of your book is really more about the overreaction. You point to the Hong Kong flu in the 1960s that also killed hundreds of thousands of people that hardly anyone who lived through it remembers. And you have a nice chapter explaining why actually being isolated in home is not really as great as a lot of people are saying. But in general, it seems to me that you're making actually quite a few of the same arguments that American conservatives are making, which is to say that we're simultaneously underestimating the effects, the economic effects of the mitigation measures, all of the shutdowns and quarantines, not just in developed countries like France or the United States, but the really terrible effects that this will have in poor countries around the world, which is a perfectly reasonable argument that you need to have some balance between mitigating a disease and harming people in other ways. So I'm wondering, one of the nice things about France is that you in France are not nearly as polarized as we are here in the United States. And I'm actually quite curious to see what reaction your book will get in an American audience, because I would say that, making those same arguments in our political context is actually going to make you sound like a supporter of Donald Trump, or one of these conservatives that really is saying this is all just a terrible mistake, that we vastly overreacted to the disease, we've damaged ourselves in terrible ways. So maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Okay, if the American conservatives care about Bangladesh, it's a good news. If the American conservatives care about the hundreds of millions of have-nots and of people suffering from hunger in the rest of the world, that's a good news. What I see is that the American conservatives of today, alas, say America first. The rest of the world can go to hell, can die. They don't care. They don't give a shit. So no, this is, for me, the people like Donald Trump, they commit the two mistakes. Number one, to deny the pandemic, which is virtually, potentially criminal. And number two, when they react to the pandemic, it is to say, we are going to close our borders, we are going to refrain and to shorten the chains of production, we are going more than ever to cut the ropes and the ties with the rest of the world, and we are going to enclose America on itself, which is also a big mistake. My point of view is not that. My point of view is the point of view of someone who is familiar to other stages of the world, the point of view of someone who visited just before the pandemic and just after one of the most terrible refugee camp in Europe, which is in the island of Lesbos. My point of view is the point of view of someone who was reporting recently before the pandemic about Syria and about Kurdistan in Syria. And I ask, what happens in these countries? What happens in populations who don't have the chance, like Europeans, to have a proper, great healthcare system, or like the Americans, to have a prosperity with some spare money? So this is my point. And I think that the reply to the pandemic is not more selfish, national or personal selfishness, but oppositely, that it is more awareness of the rest of the world, more brotherhood with the rest of the world, and especially for those who are less privileged than us. This is my position.
So let me, though, ask you how you would have translated. So those observations, it seems to me, are completely correct. And I think we are not anywhere in the developed world paying enough attention. It's not just poor people in poor countries, it's also authoritarian leaders using the opportunity. I mean, you talk about this in the book, to expand their powers and to roll back democracy. And we've seen lots of examples. So I think that that's something that everybody ought to worry about. I guess my question is how you would have translated your observations about the kind of moral panic that has ensued, that's caused this damage, how you would have done things differently. It seems to me that one of the big problems with COVID-19 is just the nature of the disease, that it appears to be extremely contagious, very easy to catch, but it's also quite variable in its effects. And so it kills a relatively small number of the people that it infects. Some people get it asymptomatically, they don't even know they've had it, and others, have a period of sickness and then they recover and then they're fine. And in a way, that's a much harder disease to deal with than Ebola, for example, that produces very gruesome consequences if you get it within 48 hours. You know you have it and it's terrible and it's almost a death sentence. And so one of the big problems in dealing with the epidemic everywhere is how do you get people to take this seriously, that they should do social distancing and they should wear masks and so forth, unless you scare people. And obviously in the United States, one of the big problems we've had is that not enough people were scared, and so they go to big parties and then they pass around the disease, and that's why our infection rates and death rates are 10 times what they are in Europe. So how would you actually, as a practical matter, have mitigated the consequences of dealing with the disease in such a way that it wouldn't have harmed those people in developing countries, or poor people in the United States, for that matter, or in France, that it's harmed?
First of all, I have to be very clear. For me, to wear a mask when it is required is an obligation. And I lived in my country, in France. I was absolutely obedient to the regulations, the sanitary regulation, mask, physical distancing, lockdown at home, and so on. This is clear. What I would have done concretely, I would say three things. It looks like nothing, but it is a lot. First of all, I think we should have, and we should still, choose better our words when we are media, when we are a politician, whatever. For example, people say social distancing. I don't like this word. I'm sorry, but social distancing is creating in the global narrative an idea which is properly disgusting. I spent my life fighting social distance. I spent my life thinking and acting in order to reduce social distance between rich and poor, between those who are lucky enough to be born in a developed country and the others, and so on. So this sort of detail, why say social distancing and not physical distancing or another words? And there is, in the way in which a lot of us jumped into this rhetoric, something which was not sane, and which was a sign of a very reactionary reaction to this pandemic. Number two, the rest of the world, America first or the rest of the world? My recommendation, if I was, I don't know, if I had any influence on television channel, I would try to devote at least a portion of the time of the news to give news of the rest of the planet, of what is happening in the space of influence of Erdogan, what is happening with Putin, what is happening with Xi Jinping, what is happening, how are moving the illiberal leaders who, as you said, consider this pandemic as a divine surprise and as an opportunity to push their advantage. We were living, and we are still living in big part, in a sort of parallel universe where only COVID exists, and where in France, in Europe, like in America, we have hardly any news of the rest of the stage. This is a second thing which, according to me, could be done in the next step of the pandemic, to try to watch the rest of the world. And number three, of course, we had and we still have to hear, to listen to the medicine, to the doctors, to the scientists. And again, when they do a terrific job, and when they save life by risking their own life, it is pure and mere heroism. But there are other sorts of people who have something to say about a pandemic. For example, I would have appreciated Mr. Macron, my president, or president of any developed country, to accept in his advisory council some psychiatrists able to give informations about what can be the effects of confinement on mental health. I would have appreciated a president of a democratic country to host some representative of NGOs dealing with violence against women in the family, by the husband, which seem to have increased in a dramatic way. So these sort of people should have been listened to. Unions, workers, unemployed, representative of churches dealing in America with minority, especially impoverished. They should have had also their word to say, and so on and so on. Which concretely, what we can do, but not yesterday, we can still do tomorrow, is to open the debate, is to open the floor to teachers. For example, is the idea to go back to homeschooling a good idea for America? Is it a good idea from a liberal point of view, homeschooling, which, as we all know, have a mechanical effect of reproducing inequalities and making the privileged children even more privileged? So is homeschooling the solution? How can we do, and in which delay, in how much time, in order to open the schools again? Teachers should have been listened in those advisory boards, which were like a help and a shelter for the democratic leaders. There was a lot of people, and there is a lot of people who should be given the voice to.
Well, okay. I hate to bring this back to the kinds of arguments American conservatives are making, but that's basically what they were saying. I mean, forget about their ignorance of the outside world. That's a given. But the argument was health is not the only social good. There's other goods like employment, like having a job, like being able to go to school, and therefore there's a trade-off. The health professionals are ignoring the fact that there's a trade-off, and therefore we need to listen to other social voices, as you put it. And the policy conclusion they drew from that is let's open up as soon as we can. I mean, that was just clearly Trump's message over the last several months. And as a result, there was a rush, especially in Republican-led states in the United States, to open up before the medical professionals thought it was safe to do. And what we've seen over the past 6 weeks is just a monumental rise in infections. The death rate is going up in all of those states, and a lot of them are having to shut down again. So I don't think anyone in theory would, deny that there's a trade-off, that you need to think about other goods other than, how many people are dying. They need to go to school, they need to go to their jobs, and so forth. But following that in the way that we did in the United States led to a real disaster, whereas in Europe, like I said, the infection rates and the death rates are 1/10 what they are in the United States. How do you account for that difference? And I think it was that authorities in Europe actually took the shutdown part much more seriously than they did. They also understood that you needed to get back to work and open up the economy, but they were much more cautious in taking, and they took advice, from the medical professionals that tempered their desire to open things up again.
The difference between, for example, France and America, first difference is that we had a leadership. You don't have leadership. This is the first thing. A real leadership with a clear will to go through this tragedy. There was this will, this wish and will in the French leadership, which did not exist in the chaotic and erratic behavior of American presidents. Second difference, there was in the European leadership, apparently, and I think so, a real concern for human lives. There was a real concern how to make the good trade-off, as you say, how to deal between the necessity of lockdown and the dangers of the same lockdown. There was this problematic. The idea was life first in France and in most of European countries, except the illiberal, except Hungary, for example, where this concern was at the second rank. In America, among those who, alas, are today ruling the country, I don't think that saving life was the real concern. And number three, the problem in France was that we did not have enough masks, as you know. In Europe, we were not prepared. But at least the idea was very soon expressed by every responsible people that it was a necessity, that it was a vital requirement to wear a mask and to maintain physical distancing. Maybe we did not have the elements, we did not have the mask, but at least there was a clear message saying that if we don't want to be a danger to our neighbor, the mask was necessary. So these are the differences between Europe and America. But this being said, we are not obliged to let us taken into hostage or hijack by the dichotomic debate. Maybe in some conservative voice, if some conservatives say that you can die when you are very poor from unemployment, okay, they're right. If some conservatives say that homeschooling is a bad solution and that public school is one of the ways which humanity found to reduce and to flatten the curve of social inequality, fine, okay. The crazy guy also say that it is full light at midday is crazy, but the fact that it is full light at midday, why not? This tragedy is too big. There are too many casualties to play games with that. And to play games means play politics and to let this tragedy herself to be taken hostage by an election, though it is important, by a political debate, though it means, of course, a lot. The respect for the dead, the respect for the agonizing, and the respect for those who escaped, who survived from the suffocation, needs at least that we look at the things with a fair and honest and humble way, and not with political arguments and political games.
Yeah.
That's what I believe. That's what I try to do in my book, honestly.
I actually think that if this pandemic had not occurred in an American presidential election year, that we probably would have responded to it better, because I do think that on both sides, people understood that Donald Trump's fate, for better or worse, would hang on the response, and certainly a lot of his motivation was really governed not by any kind of sophisticated trade-off in terms of social goods, but what he calculated would be best for him prior to November of this year. And I think that most people have understood that the trade-off between health and the economy is not a simple one. I think what we've learned as a result of our experience is that you really can't open up the economy until you get control of the disease, and therefore, privileging the health side is important. Now, let me bring up another interesting point in your book. Chapter 1 is entitled "Come Back, Michel Foucault, We Need You Now." So Michel Foucault is not one of my favorite authors. But I understand why you made that reference, that it's in this discussion of expertise, and particularly health expertise. And you make a lot of, I think, quite legitimate points that, there's been a kind of worship of medical experts as a result of the pandemic, but you point out that their expertise is, first of all, limited. They're not experts on all social matters. They're not experts on education or on the economy or other things. And even within the medical realm, there's a lot more disagreement and uncertainty that a lot of times people are not willing to acknowledge. And I certainly think in the United States that's been the case. There's a kind of worship of Anthony Fauci because Trump doesn't like him, and so many people just reflexively say, well, we have to trust people like Dr. Fauci. So that's all true. The point I think where you bring in Foucault is his argument that they're actually in disagreement. There's actually a hidden power issue. That actually, what people are arguing about is not a kind of rational discussion of policies or theories, but it's really an assertion of power. And in many cases, what we're seeing is a kind of assertion of the power of the expert community. But that's just one of many power centers in the society. Now, the specific reason I don't like Foucault is that in the United States, so again, absolutely no question that arguments and discourse reflects power, right? That powerful people can say certain things that marginalized people can't, and so forth. But what that's led to in the United States is a kind of theoretical or philosophical support for a kind of identity politics that says that essentially identities are all just about power, that there's actually no common basis on which we can, there's no human universality, that every identity group has its own lived experience. And if there's a disagreement, it's just a power game between, powerful people and less powerful people. And therefore no, way of actually getting past these fixed identities. Now, I assume that that's not your perspective, but I really do think that, Foucault has been responsible for the rise of critical theory, for certain form of cultural studies that in American universities is very, very common and powerful now, and underlies, a kind of idea that we have that everything is just a matter of these particular identities, that there really is no ability to have common discourse. There's no universal human values. If we say that human rights, for example, you spent your life defending universal human rights, but by that school, you'd simply say, well, that's just Bernard-Henri Lévy exerting his power as a white male to define the agenda in a certain way that doesn't necessarily correspond to the interests of other marginalized groups.
About Michel Foucault, I would say today, and I say in my book, the following. Number one, complete misunderstanding of those who make Michel Foucault the hero of differentialism and of identity politics. Nothing is more opposite to his thought. Michel Foucault was a son of Adorno, and he really believed that identity was it. He was not a believer in identity. Michel Foucault, there are a lot of texts where he said that what interests him is precisely what breaks an identity, what makes an identity complex, what sophisticates an identity, and nothing was more remote from him than what we see today under the flag in America especially, but also in Europe, of the identity politics. He had nothing to do with that. I really believe that. It's a misunderstanding by people who probably did not read him or misread. Number two, the Michel Foucault who interests me is the author of Naissance de la Clinique, the birth of the clinic. And this, Michel Foucault predicted that the most efficient pattern of power for tomorrow is the medical pattern. The transformation of politics into clinics, or the replacement of politics by clinics, for him, in a very cold way of analyzing, was the solution for those who want to exert a real and efficient power. Number two. And number three, he announced with all his last text at Collège de France about biopower and biopolitics and so on, he announced a sort of system of power where the power would be exerted not by big machinery, not by big police or big army and so on, but like a poison instilled in our bodies, organs, maybe cells. And for him, this dream of control of our biologic being was the dream of the uber powerful, or those who dreamt of that. And I think that he died very early and too early to see the accomplishment, embodiment of his prophecy. Because today, what you are seeing with what we were already seeing before the pandemic, but which is accelerated by the pandemic, is exactly that. Through the artificial intelligence, the high technology devices, our agreement with the idea of being, of having some systems entering in our privacy, digging into our secrets, requiring from us to deliver our contacts and so on. In all this pattern of discipline, of surveillance, which is put into motion since a few months with high speed, there is the embodiment of the system of biopower or of micropolitics, which Michel Foucault feared and suspected ready to come. This is Michel Foucault, which interests me in this book.
I mean, I think you're really seeing that being put into place in China and in certain other Asian countries where there's less suspicion of the state and less, support for individual autonomy. So that's clearly true. And I think it's also quite correct that there is a effort to medicalize everything. I mean, in the United States, for example, a lot of people say that we ought to classify gun violence as a medical condition or a medical emergency that needs to be dealt with through public health means, as opposed to being essentially a political argument over, the right to own a gun and potentially oppose the government versus, certain public safety concerns. And I think obviously that sort of thing is a political, issue that ought to be fought out in a political arena and not something that should be simply classified as, as something that will be solved by medical technocrats. So there are a number of questions that are appearing on the chat line. So let's start by asking you this, that you made a distinction between social distancing and physical distancing. Isn't that just a semantic distinction with no real practical difference because it amounts to, to the same policy?
Yes, but as I am an old reader of Michel Foucault, I believe that semantics has an importance, and that semantics contribute to shape our way of thinking and the society in which we will be one day. Yes, it's semantic, but it is very important.
Mm-hmm. But it wouldn't necessarily have led to a different policy in terms of people not being allowed to gather and meet their friends.
No, it would, of course not. The gathering is the same danger, or whatever you call him. But the difference would be that by repeating social distance on and on, you transform your neighbor into an enemy. You rebuild, you give back legitimacy to all the social distance which liberals fight since there is a liberalism, and so on. This makes a difference concretely. Of course, not the match of football which have been forbidden the same way. We would have made this conversation by Zoom as we are doing it. Mm-hmm. But at least we would not have considered as normal to live in a world with social distance. We would not consider as normal a world where shaking hands, for example. You spoke about Dr. Fauci before. And thanks God he's here. Honestly, thanks God America has Fauci. But he can say also some inappropriate words. For example, he gave recently an interview to Wall Street Journal or New York Times, I don't know, about shaking hands. And he said that he assumed that shaking hands will not come back so soon. I don't have the correct quote. American interests will check. For me, this sentence was terrible because, of course, I hope that when the pandemic is over, we will embrace ourselves again. I hope we will shake hands more and more, because shaking hands is apparently nothing, but it's a huge step of civilization. The moment when humanity, American, European, and in other parts of the world, humanity, this started to shake hands, what a transformation it meant. It was a gesture of peace. it was a gesture of mutual trust and faith and contract. It was a gesture of equality and of solidarity. We began to shake hands when we started thinking inappropriate to look down at someone or to look up when the other one was supposed to be higher than us, and so on. So this idea of shaking hands face to face, for me, is a democratic and liberal achievement. The mask, I am favorable to mask. Again, I think that the refusal of wearing masks is criminal. And I think that those who mix the question of the mask with freedom of expression are just nuts, are stupid morons. There is nothing to do between freedom of expression, First Amendment, and the mask. But I would not like, till the end of my life, a humanity with mask. I like to see the face of the people with whom I am in relation. I think that the face-to-face, the confrontation of two faces, is the beginning of ethics and of an ethical relationship. So 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, whatever, with masks, okay, because of the pandemic. If we were to accept smoothly the idea that for hygienic reasons, it is not so bad at the end of the day to have a mask as we have a shirt or a pant, I think that it would be a way back in civilization, and that we would have reacted to the tragedy we are facing, not in a progressive way, but in a reactionary and hyper-conservative way. And my concern is what will happen after. I don't want the liberal principles to make a jump back.
That actually is a good segue into one of the YouTube questions as to whether the different responses taken by different countries don't just reflect some of the underlying strengths and weaknesses in this country. Now, just the issue of masks and handshaking. Handshaking is not universal. They don't shake hands in Asia, particularly in Japan. Whereas in Latin countries, you sign your letters abrazos. Everybody gets a big hug, even somebody that you've casually met. And so there really are very different social practices. Obviously, people were wearing masks in Asia long before COVID arose. So maybe you could talk about that actually some of these characteristics and ways of socially interacting are really specific to different societies and cultures. And while we might want to go back to whatever that original culture was, there is, really going to be an interesting, menu of choices that societies will have as to what habits they adopt.
A culture is a system, is a structure. And of course, to wear a mask in France and to wear a mask in South Korea does not have the same meaning, because it is part of two different general patterns. But what I can tell you is that if we accept, under the pretext that it is practiced in South Korea, the idea of not shaking hands any longer, we will not have the whole, because in South Korea, there is a lot of other gestures of civility. There is a lot of other signs which show brotherhood and which are sedimented by ages, decades, centuries of civilization. It is just a part. If we go back to the not shaking hands welcome, we will not import the whole system. We will go back in our own system, in our own code of civilization, to a stage before characterized by contempt, despise, more inequality, and so on. You cannot just, I know that mask, for example, in Japan, but there are so many ways in Japan and you know that better than anyone. You know the text of Kojève about. This is a whole about Japanese culture, about the end of history. This is another story. You have so many conviviality proceedings and signs which make the wearing of a mask having a different place in the structure.
So there's another question about whether the overreaction that you talk about being grounded in a lack of leadership, particularly in the U.S. Now, maybe we should take off the in the U.S. I guess the way I would reformulate that question a bit, because the U.S. answer is pretty obvious, but to reformulate it, if you took seriously your fears about the overreaction, and you were a leader of the United States or another liberal democracy, what would you have done? How would you have mitigated this reaction and tempered it so that it wouldn't have the kinds of negative consequences that you point to?
I give you one example. I told you that a few minutes ago about the refugee camp in Greece of Lesbos, which is hell on earth. You have a camp which is made for 2,000 people and which is occupied now, which that shelters 20,000 people. 20,000 people for 2,000 places. The COVID, the pandemic, has been the reason, and I think the pretext, for locking down completely the camp in the beginning of April. There is nearly 0 case of COVID in the camp of Lesbos. I was there. It is one of the first things I did after the end of the lockdown in France. I went back to this place because I knew that it was a less comfortable place than the gentle and happy few putting their Instagram dishes on Instagram. So I went there, and I saw a population of 20,000 victims of all possible plagues, disease, criminal acts, and so on. Nearly 0 COVID, a few. I came with 1,000 masks, and when I ended my distribution of masks, I learned that they did not need it. But the democratic state of Greece decided to lock down, which means no access to medicine, no access to a drugstore, a pharmacy, and no possibility to step out of the jail. So if I was a leader of the Greek democracy, I would certainly have investigated more, discovered that in the camp, for whatever reason, of Lesbos, maybe because there are a lot of doctors, you have very few cases of COVID, and I would have left the state of affairs as it was. It was not very brilliant because it is a terrible place, but at least I would not have added darkness to obscurity and lockdown to misery and suffering, this new suffering to the old one. This is an example, but there are so many. Each case is specific.
So there's another question about whether the COVID epidemic represents either an opportunity or a setback for populists or the populist movement. Certainly a lot of the populist leaders like AMLO in Mexico or Bolsonaro in Brazil or Donald Trump in the United States have not handled the epidemic well, which suggests that maybe they'll be held accountable for it. But there's other reasons for thinking that populists may get a big boost because of the support for closing borders and for greater nationalism and so forth. So what's your prediction in this regard?
First of all, before prediction, my disgust. The very idea of the pandemic being an opportunity disgusts me, and I find it worst of obscenity. A pandemic is never an opportunity. It has to be cured. It has to be gone through, not used as a tool, number one. Number two, I am disgusted by those who consider the pandemic as a punishment. And you have this temptation on both sides of the political spectrum. In America, you have some evangelic churches on the extreme right who say on and on every Sunday that the pandemic is a punishment for all the sins which the liberals have committed in the West. And on the left side, you have some radicals who say exactly the same, that it is a punishment not of the sky, but of Mother Earth for the crimes we committed against ecology, against the climate, against all of that. So this idea of our suffering, of the suffering of our neighbors being a punishment, being well-deserved because it is a price to pay for some sins we committed, for me, is the summit of disgust. Now, number three, what I believe is that at the moment when we are speaking, there is on the two sides people who actually try to make it an opportunity. We have people who say, we have a sentence for that in France, which is divine surprise. Charles Maurras, the leader of the French extreme right, when France lost in front of Germany, said it is a divine surprise. Why? Because it will help him, he thought, to implement his own French fascist program. Today, you have Mr. Orban, Mr. Putin, many populist leaders who say it is a divine surprise. We did not dare to ask full powers. We did not dare to cut the ties from the rest of the world. We did not dare to close our borders against migrants. Now we have a reason to do it. The COVID provides the opportunity. On the other side, you have on the left, and I'm sorry, you have on the left people who said, we dreamt for so long the process of globalization to be stopped. We dreamt to show, to check if it was possible for the planet to continue with a sort of cut of the globalization process. The pandemic makes it. We dreamt it, the pandemic did it. And they say, I quote a lot of text in the book of these radical leftists. They say, we should not miss the crisis. We should not fail to use it the proper way. And this for me is the symmetric and the equivalent of the extreme right opportunism. And the deaths of the COVID deserve better than the competition of opportunism of both extremists.
So that actually leads to another question. So in one of the other chapters in your book, you talk about these people on the left and environmentalists and Greens who are talking about how wonderful it is to be able to see Paris without any smog or pollution, to see the streets looking the way they did, 100 years ago without all of these crowds of tourists and so forth. And I think you make a strong case about why that is not the appropriate response. But I guess my question would be, assuming this pandemic goes away because of a vaccine or something that appears in the next year or so, and the epidemic subsides, how do you see, the world? What changes would you actually like to see? Presumably nobody wants to see New Delhi go back to being so polluted that, children are dropping dead from lung disease, which has substantially been eased by the fact of the lockdown. So how would you think about a future that, wouldn't be as extreme as what you've just quoted, but might actually make the world a nicer place to live in?
I did not change my mind. I think that the situation you describe in India is, I know it well, and since decades and decades, is unbearable. That the entire world should mobilize itself in order to make New Delhi and Bombay and others and Dhaka breathable cities. And this is a world affair. But I would say also that the image of columns of tens of thousands of people starving, quitting the cities in emergency without any alternative solution, going back to a remote village where there is no more resource is not the good alternative. This what I dream, what I wish is a real will to repair this unfair world, as I try to do with my modest ways since always, but certainly not a brutal and sudden radical change, which will put half of the people of the world into a dramatic situation. Mankind, I did fight all my life on two fronts. Number one, to try to repair, to contribute to repair this sort of situation you describe. But number two, resist the temptation of considering humanity as a laboratory for a radical experience. Humanity is not a laboratory, is not a place in which some smooth Pol Pot should make their experiments. Let's see what happens if we empty New Delhi. Let's see what happens if we decide all of a sudden not to cut any commerce with India and to make at home in France or in America all that is coming from Bangladesh. I'm sure that there is a more equitable commerce that has to be organized and that has to be built, but certainly not radically, certainly not like going from darkness to light all of a sudden, because this might be an interesting experience, but those who will pay the price are not those who made the experience. They will be those who are the victims of the experience.
Well, we're just about out of time. Let me just pose one brief question to close, which is about China, because obviously China's, they were responsible for starting the pandemic, but they've been pretty effective in containing it in their own borders. And many people are predicting that the center of the global economy and also the center of global politics will shift in a Chinese direction. What's your sense of how these things will play out in the coming months and years?
The process started before the pandemic. This process of shifting power, it will certainly not slow down after the pandemic, and for one reason: the Chinese high technology, the Chinese pattern of power won a real victory in these recent months. Few months ago, there was in the world two patterns of internet. There was the American one, which was supposed to be more liberal, which was supposed to be more under control of the citizens, more respecting more the privacy, or at least pretending that he will respect, accepting to go in front of a Senate or a chamber to reply questions. And you had the Chinese system, which we Westerners laughed at, we mocked it, we laughed at it, which is a system which provided the tools to control every centimeter of our skin, detect an opponent in a crowd, knowing if we are ill before we are aware of this illness ourselves, and so on. What is the situation 4 months ago? I'm sorry to say, but there is, alas, a real chance that the Chinese model won the game. And even there was an idea which we went too quickly in the conversation, the very idea of an asymptomatic illness. You spoke of that in the first part of our conversation. This idea that the real ill is the one, and the most dangerous ill, is the man or woman who is ill without knowing. Illness without knowing being the worst, the most dangerous, the most contagious, and so on. This, when you think about it, is a terrible idea, which can only produce some distrust between human beings, some anxiety, and so on. This idea, if really it is implemented in our societies, if really it becomes on a long scale, not only for time of pandemics, a healthcare problem, it is a victory of the sort of panopticon, of the sort of system of watching which the Chinese companies invented since a few years. So in this case, you could say that the pandemic came from China, that the reply of the Chinese Communist Party was efficient, and that they sold their pattern of reply to the rest of the world. If it is true, if this happens, it will be a big victory, not rhetoric, but a very political victory. And I pray that this does not happen, because I am more than ever a believer in liberal values and in democratic principles. And I think that between an America, a proper America, back to her creed, as I hope it will happen next November, between this America and China, it is a real conflict of values and not only a geopolitical game. And
okay, well, I
prevail.
I strongly agree with that. So let's both hope that that will be the outcome. So Bernard-Henri Lévy, thank you very much for this conversation. The book is The Virus in the Age of Madness, published last week by Yale University Press. Please go out and buy it. And thank you all for listening to this conversation. So, Bernard-Henri, merci beaucoup.
Merci, Francis. Merci.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.